Go ahead.
Sure.
Phyllis.
Okay.
This
Good
meeting is being
afternoon.
recorded.
Good
afternoon.
Oh, it's echoing. Okay. What? Sorry, the light should turn red when I'm recording.
It's on now.
I hear it.
Okay. So welcome to this afternoon's presentation on organic gardening. Our program is presented by Bruce Kreitzberg, TBI member and generous contributor of his knowledge on all things plant-oriented. Bruce has been a gardener for over 30 years. He has both a California and Oregon contractor's license, landscape contractor's licenses. Also has the distinction of being a master gardener and master pruner certifications. And so, bringing us the hope and promise of spring, Bruce, take over.
Thanks, Phyllis, and thanks for setting all this up. So I think we have a small enough group that probably if people want to ask questions as I move through my outline and the part of the presentation that I've sort of prepared, I think it's fine to just wave at me or get my attention however you would, and I can pause to take questions along the way. But I do expect that, excuse me, I do expect that I'll move through my notes in 20 minutes or more, and that there'll be plenty of time for more questions and answers at the end. The topic of organic gardening can be a broad one to someone like me that's been doing it for so long. It's sort of a huge topic for me that I live, almost day in and day out for, as Phyllis said, the past 30 years. But it's actually the first time I've done a class that's just titled Organic Gardening before. I've given hour-long classes on organic lawn care, and I've done classes on pruning and many other things, but this is a broader topic that I haven't ever actually prepared specifically for. So it's a first go for me, and I'll just try to emphasize some of the main points that I think you would want to know. And there'll be more time in the Q&A section to customize, what I know to what you want to know. So I have an outline, and the first couple of main points on it are just very basic ones that I'll probably mostly gloss over. What is organic gardening, and why does organic gardening matter? I kind of assume I'm sort of preaching to the choir here. You all showed up for an organic gardening class, so I probably don't need to convince you of anything, but we'll take those two basic things in turn. And the organic gardening definition, I went to other sources for that, and I have a couple of them here. A basic definition of organic gardening is gardening with materials derived from plants, animals, and minerals, not from petroleum-based products, pesticides, herbicides, synthetic fertilizers, etc. So here's another definition I found. Organic gardening is growing crops and plants that without the use of synthetic chemical fertilizers or pesticides. Organic gardening focuses on creating a healthy environment for plants to thrive in, rather than gardening reactively to problems. So the difference in conventional gardening, or just gardening in general, with organic gardening is a small one. It's not enormous. It's mostly a background difference in methods and approaches, with the results that people want being mostly the same. Why does it matter? Well, organic gardening matters for reasons that have to do with things like sustainability, pollution, and environmental stewardship. By turning away from harmful synthetic products, organic gardening reduces soil contamination, loss of topsoil, reduces water pollution, toxic runoff, and the harm and endangerment of the macro and the micro food chains,
No,
starting with
Lisa.
insects and microorganisms in the soil. And food grown through organic methods is likely to be free of herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, and synthetic fertilizer residues. So those are just basics that you probably know already, but I just thought I would rally around the topic a little bit for the moment. And the next thing I have to talk about is the bigger category of how do you do it? How do you transition from conventional gardening towards organic gardening?
Wasting more time doing this.
Getting a little sound from somewhere there. So I have an A, B, C, D, E, and F for that. First step, I think, is excuse me, safely retiring the synthetic products that you use. So I don't know what each of you have in the tool shed or in the garden shed, but it's pretty common to see some products, particularly fertilizers, but also pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, things like that, that are tools in a typical gardener's toolkit to combat problems, and the synthetic fertilizers to enhance the performance of plants, because many plants do need nutritional supplements. And so the first step would be to set those things aside and, excuse me, dispose of them in a responsible way, which in most cases means taking them to hazardous waste at the Lane County transfer station or Lane County dump over in Glenwood. The second thing is, I think, second important point would be more of a change in your frame of mind, deciding to tolerate minor plant or produce damage. That's an important point, because if you make the switch towards organic gardening, particularly with food crops, but also, excuse me, also with ornamentals, you'll find that it's not always easy. If you buy organic produce in the store, it costs more for a good reason. It's much harder to farm that way, and you'll find it a little bit harder to garden that way if you have exactly the same expectations. Excuse me, I have a chronic cough, unfortunately, and sometimes it gets triggered just by a lot of talking, and I'm going to be talking a lot, so you'll probably hear some more coughing. Sorry. Anyway, deciding to tolerate some level of usually cosmetic imperfection with your plants or with your food crops is an important conversation to have with yourself or whoever you're sharing your garden with. And you can decide for yourself, obviously, in a case-by-case basis, what your threshold is of tolerance. In some cases, something might be really, really dear and important to you, and you want to continue caring for that plant, even though it doesn't look great. In other cases, you might decide that you don't want to take the steps that you have to, or that the plant looks too far gone. It's past your threshold, you might say, and you can let that go. Let's see, other things about that point. Yeah, I think that's enough about that point. The next point I would make, the third, is about choosing the right plant for each place. Right plant, right place. That's really an important step for an organic gardener. With food crops, it makes a difference too. One thing that you should learn, I mean, I can't tell you everything about organic gardening, needless to say, in a 20-minute or even an hour talk, but you'll be doing research on your own, I'm sure. And research can be in books, online, at the nursery, at the garden center, over the back fence with your neighbor or anyone else that you know that likes to garden. And you'll exchange ideas, and one thing that you'll want to learn about is what you're likely to have success with, and which crops or which plants are more likely to be troublesome. So sometimes in the Master Gardener program, they used to refer to how much effort something took as how many inputs. How many inputs does it have? How many inputs does it take from the gardener or the person caring for this plant or this crop to maintain it? And which plants have the most inputs? Come to think of it, it wasn't Master Gardeners, it was back in a junior college class. But anyway, the highest, probably the plant that has the highest number of inputs is turf grass, is your lawn. After all, if you think about all the inputs that you have to grow lawn, you have to mow it, right? That's about 30 times a year for most people who are growing a lawn. About 30 times a year, you get out a lawnmower. Otherwise, it's not really a lawn anymore. It's something else. You have to water it, and water it a lot, prodigiously. Some people put an edge on it around the perimeter. Some people fertilize it. Some people add lime to it to get the pH where it's supposed to be. Sometimes you reseed it. Sometimes you aerate it or dethatch it. And probably other things that are farther down the line in terms of how commonly you do them. But that's a lot of inputs right there for something. Probably the second highest, the plant with the commonly grown plants that probably have the second highest number of inputs is probably roses. And that has a lot to do with our expectations of roses. And it has to do with, in the case of the turf grass, that has to do with our expectations too. When I asked before we started about who has a lawn, two people raised their hands sort of like this, well, I have a lawn, but I sort of barely care for it. And that's in a sense, that's sensible, because you're wanting to have the utility of your lawn, but you're not necessarily wanting to engage and indulge in all of those high energy and sometimes high cost inputs that having a really manicured lawn requires. Well, likewise with roses. A rose that's established in the ground for a few years is usually a pretty tough plant. They're actually, I won't say they're hard to kill, but they're pretty, yeah, they're just pretty vigorous plants that can hold on to life pretty well most of the time. But if you look in magazines, or if you see commercial for fertilizer with roses in it on television, then you have an expectation that is really hard to match. You have something with perfect foliage and repeat flowerings and things like that. So that's another really high maintenance or high input plant. Fruit trees score very high as well. Interestingly, roses and fruit trees are in the same family, right? They're all in the rose family. Most of the fruit trees that we grow, the stone fruits, the apples, the pears, the plums, the cherries, those are all in the rose family. And fruit trees also tend to have a lot of inputs because they tend to be of interest to pests, to insects, to fungus, to other disease. And of course, we need to prune them if we want to have maximum productivity, and we need to control those. We need to control those pests if you want to have fruit that, again, meets a certain threshold of expectations. You might call it table quality fruit that we're used to, and not something that has caterpillars crawling through it, right? So anyway, back to the point, which was the right plant in the right place. Choosing plants that are more likely to succeed in the environment that you're able to give them is a crucial step in being able to garden organically. If you live in an area that tends to be extremely wet, then you want to do your homework to see what plants can tolerate having wet roots so much of the time. If you're in Eugene and you have typical Eugene soil, which is to say that it tends to be heavily clayish, then you have soil that can often be wet or damp much of the year, and during the summer it dries out and gets incredibly hard. So you need to consider plants that can tolerate clayish soils. On the other hand, if you have imported soil into your garden, especially if you have a berm or a mound or a raised bed, then you have a completely different soil than you have normally, than you would have with the existing Eugene layer. If you have purchased soil, you have something that's very, very porous, doesn't hold water nearly as well as the clay holds it. You have something that is nutritious initially when you first buy it, but the nutrients aren't held as tightly as they are in clayish soils, and so you would need to fertilize more. Anyway, I'm just giving you an example sort of off the top of my head about researching the conditions that you have that you're going to grow your food in, or that you're going to have for your ornamental garden. Makes a huge difference, along with common sense things like, what is the sun aspect? Is it windy? How often are you able to water it? Do you have an automatic watering system, or is it dependent on you? Are you there all summer, or does it have to sometimes go 2 weeks while you're away? What else? Does it have competition from other neighboring plants? Is it secondary to another plant? Is this plant going to have a short life, or do you want it to live a long time? So again, just encouraging that you do your research with the plants that you choose for your garden, in the same way that you might when you get to the point in life where you're choosing furniture a little more carefully. So say you're decorating your house and you're 18 years old or you're 20 years old, you just moved out, you take whatever you get, right? You get whatever your siblings or your parents hand off to you, or maybe something that someone left on the sidewalk for someone just like you. But if you're in your 30s or 40s, maybe you get to a different stage in life and you can choose your furniture. If you're lucky, you can choose your furniture a little more carefully. And maybe if you're a person who really puts thought into that, you choose each piece really carefully. So that's the kind of thought I'm encouraging that you use when you're designing or redesigning your garden, if you want to be a successful organic gardener, because choosing the right plant for the right place mitigates so many other challenges or problems that come down the line from that. The next piece I have under how to do it is sorry, give me just a moment. Yes, the dreaded pest management piece. So I won't say a whole lot about this right away, but instead, I'll just say a little bit and come back to this with its own heading later. Basically, when you're organic gardening, what you're going to try to do is replace pretty powerful synthetic products with, sorry to say, a lot more work. What you might be doing is more observation, more attention, more repetition, more familiarity, more research, and well-timed, well-chosen action for your plants that you're growing. So I don't know if I'm being too abstract here, if you know what I'm talking about, but basically I'm talking about how you manage or deal with problems that come up with your plants, how you deal with pests such as insects, fungi, virus, environmental challenges. And when you're gardening conventionally, you have, thanks to the petrochemical industry, a lot of tools at the store that can be in your arsenal that can help you. There are rose products on the market and have been for decades. It's called systemic. You shake some colorful synthetic pellets onto the ground around your roses, and you're good for months or for the rest of the year with control of the basic diseases. And some of them even have certain insecticides built into them that get into the tissue of the rose plant's foliage and discourage some of the most common insects that bother the roses. So there you have something incredibly convenient. Likewise, people who are growing lawns have weed and feed. It's so cheap, $15, $20. You can get enough weed and feed to spread on a 5,000 square foot lawn. So enough for a normal person's lawn, which might be 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet, enough for a whole year for just $15 or $20. But if you've decided to garden organically, you'll eschew those things. You'll bypass those, and you'll have to replace that with more knowledge, more observation, more familiarity with exactly what you're dealing with, and with homework. So you're trading convenience for knowledge, essentially, and it will require engagement and action. So that's maybe as much as I'll say about that right now. I'll come back to a few more things about pest management a little further down the outline. Next point is about feeding the plants, fertilizer. And in this, I would say that you're at what a lot of organic gardeners consider to be sort of the crux of organic gardening, which is that unlike in conventional gardening, where you have fertilizers that feed the plants, in organic gardening, you don't really feed the plants, you feed the soil. So it's a completely different system. It's analogous, I sometimes say, to taking a multivitamin in the morning, a conventional multivitamin that has in it the nutrients that your body needs, or instead eating your broccoli. So when you eat your broccoli, or you eat your veggies, like, every day, you are getting nutrients in those things that your body only gets when it starts to break down that food. It's different than the multivitamin pill or the vitamin pill that has those nutrients or elements right in it, and it's just distributed very quickly in a water-soluble source into your body. Likewise with fertilizer, synthetic or conventional fertilizers actually provide the nutrients that your plants need, mainly nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but also all those micronutrients, iron, copper, magnesium, et cetera, et cetera. In organic gardening, the fertilizers that we use or compost don't do that at all. What you're doing is you're feeding the microorganisms in the soil. So every shovelful of soil in your garden probably, hopefully, contains billions of microbial organisms. And when you are gardening organically, if you're doing it well, you're providing food to enhance that population. They eat the fertilizer that you've provided, or the compost, or what nutrients they can glean from the soil. And what they excrete, that is what the plants are able to use. So in a sense, you're just using nature's system, but you're enhancing nature's system. So the organic gardener's adage is usually feed the soil, or feed the soil, not the plant. And again, I'll come back to that with a little bit more detail a little farther down the outline. The last point, I think it's the last, yeah. The last point I want to make under this general heading of how do you do it is just about the compost pile. And the compost pile I've called the not so secret of organic gardening, because I think we've known about compost piles for a long time, most of us. Eugene, Oregon even has, or at least 20 years ago, had a composting specialist on staff with the city of Eugene, and that was 20 years ago. So the American public has known about composting for a long time, and with good reason. It's just a brilliant way to sort of manufacture in your own backyard, usually in a back corner somewhere, a product that costs you little to nothing and is as good as gold. People call it gardener's gold. So you can do it in a number of ways. Some people build a box to keep their compost in. 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot is sort of the minimum size. 4 by 4 by 4 is, for some people, about the maximum size that they can handle. Some people buy a barrel or a plastic bin that is on a big swivel and can rotate to help turn it. I think the easiest is just to have a big heap a big pile, but it's not as attractive looking. But the best composting I've ever done was usually with a big heap, because it's so easy to tend to. You can turn it, you can move the pile from here to there and mix it, and have easy access for it without anything in your way. You can water it, which you do need to do. You need to keep it with the right level of moisture. And you can see how it's progressing. You can stick a thermometer in it, a soil thermometer, see if it's exceeding that base level of 150 or 155 degrees, how well it's going, and you can see which parts of the pile are getting hot, which parts are cooling down. I can't really, in the context of this class, and I think what we want to do, give you all the details about composting. That would be a 10 or 15 minute lesson by itself. But I'll just tell you that it's a fun thing to learn how to do if you haven't done it already. You'll want to pay attention to what's called carbon-nitrogen ratio. So carbon and nitrogen are two elements that are in pretty much all living things. And in terms of plants and things in the garden, the greener they are, the more nitrogen they have. So grass, for example, turf grass is very high in nitrogen. It's very green. The leaves that just came off of some of your plants are very high in nitrogen. At the other extreme, there's things that are very high in carbon. Bark, sawdust, shredded newspapers, things like that have a very high amount of carbon in them and a very low amount of nitrogen. So green versus brown, some people would say. And the best composting, that's usually going to happen with a ratio of about 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So when you're doing your homework, if you do a little research on this because you've decided to make a compost pile, compost bin, check out that C:(N) ratio, carbon nitrogen ratio, and what the ratio is for different materials that you might mix into your compost pile. The ultimate, leaves, autumn leaves. They're already close to the 30 to 1 ratio. And so some gardeners call those gardener's gold because they're just the perfect thing for the compost pile. And they get it going in just the right direction. So anyway, maybe that's enough about composting. So questions so far? Okay. Yes, Jerry.
So are you going to talk about, like, for instance, you mentioned roses.
Yes.
I grow roses and I try an organic garden, but, you know, aphids are a very big problem for roses.
Mm-hmm.
I use dish soap, you know, I make a mix of dish soap and I spray it on the aphids, you know, that are on the rose bush. Will that make my soil non-organic anymore?
I don't think so. I think that using dish soap as an insecticide probably falls into the category of organic gardener's tools. So the organic gardener does sometimes spray things, and there's some things in the organic gardener's toolkit that are absolutely accepted by all the authorities, the certifying bodies that they have, that are surprising because some of them sound pretty chemical in their nature, such as copper sulfate, for example, is an organic product, but it's so innocuous that it is accepted for use by certified organic gardeners, and lots of the stone fruits that we eat in the store are probably protected in part by farmers who use things like copper sulfate. Definitely the dish soap that you're using mixed with water would fall into the same category. And there's other things that do too. There's a great resource for this right in our town. Down to Earth is a first-rate 5-star organic garden center. We are very lucky to have their one store right in our town. They are distributing products as far south as Santa Cruz or Santa Barbara, and as far north as I think maybe Seattle or Vancouver. But they only have one retail store, and that's ours to enjoy and benefit from. So the people in there, the ones who've been there a little while and have some experience, they have familiarity with an awesome array of products that are of use to the organic gardener. It's really a great resource. I worked there for a year when my wife and I first moved back to Eugene, and I learned a little bit more than I knew just by working there around those products. So I definitely encourage people to avail yourself of not just the products, but the knowledge of the people that work there and are familiar with the applications of those things. I'll talk more about any of these kind of specific things when I get through the main part of it. But one of the things that you can learn about with organic gardening is what is the easiest way to combat this problem. Indeed, aphids are so common on roses, especially that first flush of growth in spring, because that's the freshest and the most nutrient-rich flush of foliage that a plant ever gets, is that first flush in spring when it's getting its new leaves. And so the aphids they're all over it. They're sucking the juices out of it. And the way that I've dealt with aphids for years is even easier than what you're doing. It has a downside. I take a garden hose with a fairly aggressive nozzle, and I'll sometimes put my hand behind the part of the plant that I'm spraying, and I'll spray that population of aphids off aggressively. Again, the other hand is to back up the plant so I don't blast it to smithereens and destroy it. But a good blast with a hose on the aphids that are infesting your rose or whatever plant, do that 2 or 3 days in a row, and your problem is pretty much solved. You don't even have to mix up the dish soap. The reason is that aphids have pretty fragile bodies. There are some insects that don't. Scale comes to mind, spider mites maybe, but aphids are pretty fragile. And when you blast them with the hose, if that doesn't bust them up, then hitting the ground might. And doing it 2 or 3 days in a row means you're gonna pretty much decimate the population of aphids and probably solve your problem. And that's a perfect example. I'm getting a little bit ahead on my outline by going into this segue, but that's a perfect example of doing the simplest thing first. If it doesn't work, I've still got the option, Jerry, of going to the dish soap. And if that doesn't work, I can decide, do I want to take another step? Do I want to use something else that might be a little bit more challenging to get, or might be more expensive, or might be a wee bit more toxic? So those are decisions that you can make if you've done your homework and learned a little bit about what it is you're fighting and what it is you need to do.
Would you do the same with your aphids and the vegetables? Kale, chard?
In a lot of cases I would. Yes, I've definitely done it myself on kale and chard. And again, in that case, sort of supporting the plant while I'm doing it is even more critical, because I want to eat that foliage. I don't want to break it. I know that if it tears, that it's likely to dry out and look a little bit desiccated a few days later. So I might not be as aggressive if I'm spraying off the kale or the chard for aphids, but it's probably the first thing that I would try, is just hosing it off aggressively. And if that doesn't work, taking another step with something else that you can literally pallet.
Like neem oil?
Neem oil is a possibility, but it smells bad. I would probably go next to what Jerry suggested, or there's still something else. And I think Down to Earth sells hot pepper oil. Tell me how that chard tastes when it has the hot pepper oil on it, if you get to that step, Oriana. I have no idea myself, but it sounds interesting. So that's a little bit about the how-to. I guess we are at the point in the outline where I was going to say a little bit more about pests and pest control. Basically, the term I want to introduce for anybody that can remember it or who might be taking notes about pest control is IPM. IPM. IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management. And here I wrote down a definition. Integrated pest management is an ecosystem approach to crop production and protection, combining different practices and management strategy to grow plants while minimizing pesticide use. I added to that learn and know the life cycles of insects, of fungi, of other disease, of environmental damage. Again, it's a topic that, I'm sure at the college level they teach for entire semesters. And I could probably talk about it for much longer than the time that we have. But basically, I think the example that we have with Jerry's question just a few minutes ago is an example of IPM at work. She knows what the pest is. She's gone out there to see what it is. She has something in her toolkit to combat it, and she's chosen something that is an excellent choice. It's almost free. It's available right in her kitchen. All you need is a spray bottle and some dish soap, and you have a way of dealing with the aphids that bother the roses or whatever. The garden hose idea that I suggested is another one. But basically with IPM, you're going back to that thing that I said near the outset of the class, which is that you're replacing sort of high firepower synthetic products. Like you could go to the hardware store and get something for the roses that is going to kill any insect that tries to feed on them. But you don't need to do that. You can wait to see if there actually is an issue and then deal with it in a more sustainable and narrow way by going after the aphids if and when the aphids show up, instead of putting down a 12-month systemic pesticide. Questions about that? I guess I would add that the same goes for disease. Disease is a little bit harder to deal with than insects. It's sometimes more complicated. You don't necessarily see what the culprit is, although there's a lot of insects you can't really see very well either. But doing your homework about what the common pests are, or the common diseases are for the plants in your garden. It's not going to all happen overnight. If you have a large garden, you might have dozens of different species of plants, and you can only learn them one at a time. But you'd be in a better place as an organic gardener 2 or 3 years from now if you start to learn what those things are. In the Master Gardener's course, they had a Pacific Northwest handbook, and it doesn't have every plant in it. There's thousands of common plants that we grow, but it has the plants that people most grow and that most tend to have problems and what those common problems are. So with something like roses or fruit trees or even raspberries, it's a pretty, there's several pages with many different issues that come up. With something much more innocuous, with something much less troublesome, I guess I should say. Let me just try to think of an example. Lavender. Lavender does not have a lot of pest problems. Not a lot of diseases that come to lavender. Sometimes you'll see sooty mold on lavender, but you don't have a lot of things. So I'm sure if there were any entries in lavender in that Pacific Northwest handbook, they were very few. So anyway, learning what those things are, what the time of the year is that those things come around, that's all part of integrated pest management. Again, I can't teach it to you in a 1-hour class, but you can start to do homework on those things. And then the next big point I would make is going back to feeding the soil. So feeding the soil, I mentioned, is sort of like the crux of organic gardening. And I just wanted to say a few things about the different ways to do that, because there are a few different ways. And I just sort of broke them down into 4 major ways. One is large area soil fertilizing. So maybe you're redoing your whole garden, or you're redoing part of your whole garden, and you have an opportunity when you've cleared the ground to put fertilizers into the ground. So in that case, you're trying to get the organic fertilizers into the top inches of soil, either by spading it or by rototilling. And you're probably choosing things that have some of the micronutrients and also the major macronutrients. What I would tend to use is something that is not terribly expensive, that's readily available, and that you can afford to spread around, but also realizing that you don't get that opportunity very much, maybe being willing to put it in pretty heavily. So Again, Down to Earth can be a great resource for that. They have pretty much all the organic fertilizers that are commonly available anywhere. The simplest being things like manure and compost in bags that's been commercially manufactured. They have things that are high in nitrogen, like bat guano, seabird guano. They have blood meal, which comes from the livestock industry. They have things that are high in phosphorus, which is what helps flowering and fruit set up in plants. Things like bone meal and fish bone meal. And they have things that are high in potassium, which helps with root development. Those are the macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Potassium has sources like kelp meal. And I think so there's something called green sands and other sources of potassium, as well as some of the fertilizer mixes that they have that are great for introducing the micronutrients that you need in the soil. So that's sort of the large area of fertilizing or feeding. Small area is when you're just replacing one plant at a time, and you might put something in the hole just as sort of a pocket plant and just trying to enhance the soil around that plant. Obviously, it's not as good as doing a whole large area and trying to feed a whole vast network of microbial population in your whole garden, but it's better than nothing, and it can provide nutrients in that small area. The other ways that are more simple and probably more applicable to people who are not planning to change the garden a lot are just called top dressing and also liquid fertilizers. So top dressing is just putting something on the surface, and those nutrients get into the soil when you're watering or when rain happens. Unless you want to just cultivate them lightly into the top layers of soil. Top dressing are usually things like compost, again, manure, and the other organic fertilizers. And liquid fertilizers are a great tool to have in your toolkit. I usually apply them with a watering can and mix them up to the ratio that they recommend. Probably the best known one is fish emulsion. Fish emulsion's been around for decades. It smells terrible, but it's effective. My old business partner in California said, that's how you know it's good, is because it smells so bad. That was his logic. Anyway, fish emulsion or fish meal. And there's other ones that are intended to mix in with liquid. There's also hose end applicators, but I don't like them as much. It's very hard to know how much product you're putting down with those. So I like mixing it up in the watering can. And those kind of fertilizers are usually available to plants very fast. So if you've put tomatoes in the ground, for example, you probably tried to put them into a bed that had some organic fertilizer in it. Maybe you applied manure or compost in the off season, and you want to give them a supplement, maybe midsummer. You want to give them a little push. The easiest way to do that is with a liquid feeding. It's going to be available really fast and can do a lot of good and really make a difference. So I'm talking on, and there's a whole outline of sort of a calendar of tasks that I made, and maybe we could see if there's any questions, and that could be put on the screen. I think it's basically page 2 of the outline I sent you, Phyllis, if you have access to that, because I feel like I'm talking on, and it's 10 minutes to 3. So questions so far about whatever. Oh, I see Oriana already had her hand up.
All right.
Yeah, I've been making a list of things. First of all, you're talking about soil. I sent soil samples. Unfortunately, they came back later than I wanted, so I haven't amended yet. I haven't even been able to read them. I'm gonna either probably bring them down to earth so they tell me, but there's a lab for $18 in Portland called A&L Labs.
Mm-hmm.
And I took soil from various places in my food garden to see what is the best thing for me to amend with this year. So that might just be, I can put that link in the chat in a minute if people want to check into them. But, and I have a list of questions here. One of them is that I think I'm the only person I've ever met who has been able to kill vinca. I had a beautiful yard of vinca that came with my house, and it has some sort of rust disease. And I took pieces of it. I had someone who had done the Master Gardener class come, and she found it, and then I took pieces of it to graze, and they gave me something to spray. I mowed down the entire area so that I could just let it start growing again. I still have it. And when I pruned my blueberries this year, I think that's got it. And I don't know if it's just spreading through the yard. I've also had trouble with trees. My cherry tree, after producing 2 years of amazing cherries, died. That happened the year after my maple died, and they were very close. I don't know if that was connected, but I'm beginning to think I have something systemic happening in my yard. I don't know if you can address that at all. And I'll just also had a question about fruit trees. Someone recently said, oh, you should be watering your fruit trees, which I've never done. And so I want to know if that's something that you recommend. And yeah, and then white flies is another issue I had last year, which I had never had. But aphids I've been dealing with for years, but white flies just took over last year. And I think the last question, I'll just tack this one on. Last year, I bought this composted stuff that Rexius came out with in a blue bag. Down to Earth was selling it. Backyard Farmer was selling it. And I think it brought in stuff that I didn't necessarily want in my garden, that rocket weed. It just took over my garden. And I don't know if it came in that bag or not, but that's what I used to amend instead of compost last year.
Wow, your garden has more illness than most urgent care clinics. It's really something. But I'll try to remember some. I'll try to remember some of those things. I never saw rust on Vinca before. Was that a pretty positive identification?
It was everybody's best guess. And I could go to my garden shed and see what they told me to spray. But once it started to rain, I couldn't spray anymore. It just wasn't worth putting that stuff on the Vinca.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not rust. I don't know. It's got the Vinca started growing really spindly and having dark spots under the leaves.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I can't say for sure without seeing it, of course, and I never have previously seen rust on Vinca, but there are many different rusts, and many of them are specific to specific species of plants. Also, there's sometimes a vector between certain plants with rust. There's, for example, I want to say it's apple cedar. Apple trees and cedar trees have a connection with the same kind of rust. That's vectored by one species to the other. But anyway, when you were talking about the problem with the Vinca rust, you hit on a couple of things that I think are instructive to the whole group, and that is that you tried mowing it down, and that is clever, and that is a good tool to have in your toolkit for a ground cover like Vinca. What really commonly gets rust that is a similar ground cover is, and is just as old-fashioned or maybe more old-fashioned than Vinca is the Hypericum. Hypericum pentalobus, better known as St. John's wort. That's an old-fashioned ground cover with the big, bold yellow flower in mid or late spring or early summer that some of our grandparents probably gardened with, because it's a tough plant. It's a ground cover that can colonize an area pretty successfully. It puts its roots down about 5 or 6 inches, doesn't need much water, doesn't need any fertilizer really. But the downside of St. John's wort is that it almost always, where we live, gets rust. It gets rust, and that rust is ugly. It starts to defoliate the plant. It's almost an identification feature for me. Like, oh, I know what that is. I see the rust. It's got to be St. John's wort. It's so common. And the way I've dealt with that sometimes, in part, because I can't fully get rid of the disease, the fungal disease of rust on it. But one thing that helps is to actually run the mower over it. So some clients that had that ground cover, and it's not as popular as it was decades ago, but some people do still have it. We would actually take the mower, we'd put it on its highest setting, highest in elevation off the ground, keep the bag on it, and we would mow it in early spring or late winter to take off all of last year's, or as much of last year's foliage as we can. We would basically give it a haircut down to sneaker height or boot height. so that all that rusty foliage was pulled into the mower and taken away, and it wasn't around to all those pustules of fungi in the rust. If you leave them on the ground or if you leave them on the plant, they're all there to multiply, right? The rain's going to hit them, they get splashed around, and they help the disease to propagate itself. Does it happen anyway with my mowing? Yes, it happens anyway, but not as bad. It's one tool in the toolkit. It's another example of deciding whether you can tolerate something is part of being an organic gardener. Do you hate it? Well, you're gonna have to grub out the St. John's wort and plant something else. But anyway, back to your vinca. I would try for a positive identification, if there's something that you can do with whatever it has, such as cutting it down again and letting it start up, you can try that. There might be some product that you can put on it that might control it. For example, somebody here mentioned neem oil. Neem oil is a very useful fungicide in the organic gardener's toolkit that controls a lot of fungi. It's sort of a general purpose fungi. That might be something to try, and it would be useful a few weeks from now and going through the early part of the spring as your vinca is putting on its foliage. Sorry, my cat's going to come and interrupt everything. So I would try those things, and if you get to wit's end, then you have the option of removing the vinca and deciding to work with something else. Did it put rust on your blueberries? I tend to think not.
No.
I don't usually see rust on blueberries. I'm not sure if blueberries get rust. They very well may, and I just have never seen it. Blueberries much more often get Pseudomonas, which is a different fungal disease, which is just
How do you spell that?
the word pseudo, and then monas is spelled pretty much like it sounds. I think it's M-O-N-A-S, Pseudomonas. You can look up that and see if the damage looks like that. That's the most common fungal condition for blueberries around here is Pseudomonas, but you might just have rust. I don't know.
It's interesting you mention apples and cedar, because that vinca is on a hill between those two trees.
Oh, interesting. Well, the common problem that those have is specific to the trees, and it's a sort of horrific looking disease where the cedar trees and the apple, I think it is, they'll both get this just horrible oozing yellowish orange liquidy material dripping out of them when they get it. So it's hard to miss.
Okay,
But
thankfully I don't have that yet.
you don't have that yet. Let's see, maybe I could take on one more of the issues that you said before I go to somebody else. Tell me.
I asked about watering fruit trees.
Oh yeah. I've been giving that thought too, Oriana, because it has been unusually dry. And I think the advice that I would give about that is also general for the other plants in the garden. The things that usually we rely on to be watered deeply at this time of the year, are they getting sufficient water or are they not? I'm not sure. We had decent rain during parts of the autumn. October was okay. Then November, I think it was kind of dry. December was pretty rainy, and then January and most of February have been pretty dry. So we're now, I wish I knew what the total rain count was for the year, but I suspect that we're many, many inches behind, and that things that normally get watered very deeply as well as frequently are not. Do they have enough to enter spring? Seems like they mostly do. I mean, I would probably take my cues from the plant itself. If it fails to bud out, well, there's a huge problem and you probably missed the moment. You might try digging a hole in your garden and see if it's wet. Excuse me, 10 inches down, 20 inches down. Deeper than 20 inches, your fruit trees probably don't have very many roots at all. If it's wet 10 to 20 inches down, damp, I should say, you're probably fine. But as the temperature warms up in the coming weeks, if it stays as dry as this, do you need to deep water your trees and other woody plants? Ideally, yes. Not as often as you would in summer. You definitely don't need to go to like daily watering or 4 or 5 times a week watering. Watering once at this time of the year should take care of a deep-rooted plant like a tree for a couple of weeks. But say we get, I'm just creating a hypothetical here. Say we get to late March or April and it's 60 degrees every day. It's sunny and we're getting no more rain, and we haven't had any rain at the end of February to speak of, and almost none in March. Do you need to water the plants? Once in a while, I would. Yeah, I would if you can. I don't think you'll need to do it for everything, but I think you might need to do it for some of the more vulnerable things. Does somebody else have a question? Phyllis.
I do.
Yeah.
A couple of them. One you mentioned about lavender getting I don't know, mine is gray yucky, two of my bushes anyway. And I don't know quite how to, should I chop them all down, or not sure how to deal with that. And then my other question is about compost. Maybe I'll let you answer one and we'll go to the next.
Sure. So about lavender, one of the things to know about lavender, the lavenders that we grow here are mostly cold hardy lavenders of the English lavender species, Lavandula and Gustifolia. And they're good for usually 10 years at the most. Lavender is sort of a Mediterranean type of plant. It's really very different than things like roses and rhododendrons and camellias that can continue to grow and add beauty to the garden for decades. Lavender, no, it's really a plant that you put in the ground. It's not an annual. It is indeed a perennial, but it's not something that is long lived. It's more like 5, 6, 7 years. If you're getting 8 or 10 years out of your lavender, awesome, great. You got to enjoy it for a long time. But in my experience, most of the lavenders that have gotten to be 10 years old, they're pretty woody. They're pretty leggy, and they're pretty tired out. And it's your garden. You do what you want to do with it. But in a lot of cases, if there's a priority on things looking just as good as they can look, then it's easy and it's sensible to just pluck them out and put some new lavenders in. And then you get to go to the store and pick out some lavenders that you like, maybe different than the other variety. And I'm really curious if, not that I'm heralding or champion climate change, very much the opposite. But if the climate has to change on us, I'm going to enjoy some more California plants. That's what I'm doing. That's my salve. That's my that's my way of coping. And in California, there's more French lavenders used and Spanish lavenders, and those Spanish lavenders are awesome. They're usually a little too risky to try in Eugene, Oregon, because temperatures down to 20 will surely kill them. And we had temperatures down to 20 just a few days ago, right? So they're still probably a little risky, but I experimented this year with a client that has the means and the tolerance. I tried putting a few Spanish lavenders in for somebody to see if they will tolerate the winters here. It looks like the answer is no for now. But anyway, that's what I would say about the lavenders, is that if they're looking really rough, it might be that they've been around a long time. If you prune them too hard, when the flower show is over, if you cut them back and you cut beyond the foliage, a lot of times they don't have enough latent buds upstream or lower than where you prune to leaf out from there again, and they can become really misshapen for that reason. It's hard to do anything about that.
Okay, a quick question about a particular kind of a fungus. I've heard it called like dog vomit. It's really hideous, and I don't know if it's damaging. It doesn't appear to be, but I don't know if that's something I should guard against or how to deal with it.
Have you seen it in your garden?
Yeah.
What does it look like?
It starts out sort of a orange. It really looks like dog vomit. And then after several days, it dries, crispy, and then sort of aerates. Just flakes and comes to bits.
And was it on a specific plant or was it on the grass?
On the ground, on the dirt, in between tomato plants and some kale.
I can't think right away of what it is. I mean, maybe I know it by some other name. I'm sorry that I can't help with that.
It's
I
not a
don't know.
very romantic name, I know.
No, but I'll still look it up and see if I can find it when our time together here is done. I'll probably look it up to learn about it myself if there's anything to be found. But no, I don't know right away what that might be. A fungus that is on the ground and is not affecting any plants might just be something to ignore, to bury. I'm curious what the origin of it might be if it's not from the plants, if it might be oozing up from tree roots or something else. It's definitely not something I have a past experience with.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
All right. You said about compost, that 30-to-1 ratio. So I have my little compost keeper on my kitchen counter for my potato peels and onion skins and whatever. When I put that into my bin, am I supposed to add 30 scoops of brown
No.
something?
It's hard just by looking at something, particularly something as myriad as kitchen scraps. It's hard to know what the CN ratio of those are. But in general, the kitchen scraps are pretty nitrous. They're pretty heavy in nitrogen. And so I'm just taking a wild guess. I really don't know. But some of the kitchen scraps probably have a carbon nitrogen ratio of 10-to-1 or 20-to-1, so they're quite strong. What you want to do when you start composting to do it well is to learn to recognize, and again, this is something that you could research online or with friends or neighbors or people at Down to Earth. You want to start to pick up on the signals that your compost pile can give you about how the mixture is. So if it smells rank, if it seems like it's stinky, it probably needs more carbonous or brown material. It probably needs some sawdust, or it needs some bark, or it needs some shredded newspapers. It needs a little bit less of the high nitrogen stuff, such as food scraps or lawn clippings or new foliage, and it needs to catch up with some more carbonous material. If, on the other hand, the pile has no odor and it's not getting very hot, then it probably needs something else. It probably needs more nitrogen, a new nitrogen source, or it might be that something else basic is lacking, like it's either too dry. It needs an amount of moisture that's similar to a sponge that you already wrung out. It's damp, but it's not soggy. And I should have also added that when the compost pile does smell rank, that can also be a sign that there's too much moisture in it, that it might be decomposing anaerobically. So anaerobically, of course, just means without air. There's too much water in it, and so it doesn't have enough air in it. And kind of like all the plants that we grow, they need a combination of air and water. So there's lots of little tricks to composting that you can learn when you start to research it. But taking your kitchen scraps to the compost pile is awesome. I mean, that is such a good and simple source of nitrogen for your compost bin. And you're also doing the community, a bit of help by not putting those things into the landfill, where they produce a surprising amount of methane gas, which is a much larger contributor to climate change, to global warming, than is simply other sources of CO2. So methane is a more climate changing gas byproduct of anaerobic decomposition in landfills than people realize. Judy, you're still muted, Judy. You have to click off the mute button. There you
Okay,
go.
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is probably not related really, but since it's almost over, I live in an apartment and my balcony faces south, and I have had sun for the first time and being able to grow plants, and I'm thrilled. because my house was very dark and we couldn't do it before we sold the house. But my question is, what good tomato plant would be for a pot facing south?
Well,
And I tried down to earth and they did sell me one,
mhm,
but it didn't work.
it didn't work.
And
And
my husband put in some seeds, which my son in California said, you'll never grow tomatoes by seeds. He did get some plants and a few tomatoes, but I mean, I just want one, my pots, maybe it's a pretty big pot, but I
Good.
guess I could only have one. So could you
Yeah.
tell me?
well, I can't tell you which one you should grow. Do you want a slicer, or do you want to can, or do you want to pick cherries for the salad?
Anything that grows, that I love homegrown tomatoes. So
Well-
any kind of tomato that would be the easiest and best to grow.
How about those little orange ones? The
Yeah, the sunburst.
sun-kissed, or some of those.
Sun gold, yeah.
Sun
Sun
gold,
gold, there you
yes.
go.
Those
It's
are
hard to go
wonderful.
wrong with sun gold. So, technically, you could probably grow almost any tomato variety in a large enough pot. And it is a great idea to have a pot that's really deep, because
Yeah,
tomatoes,
this is very deep.
good, that's good.
Very
So
deep.
you'll probably benefit by having new soil, or at least amended soil in your container each year, because of course tomatoes are huge nutrient feeders.
Okay.
And I think that the advice that you got about sun gold, or one of the other little orange ones is awesome. I think those are fantastic tasting.
Okay.
Since it's a class on organic gardening, I would say that this is a chance in the class for me to say, again, doing a little research, doing a little homework pays dividends. There's plant tags on a lot of those tomato plants that you buy, and some of them have a initial V on them, and some of them have an initial F on them. And V stands for verticillium and F stands for fusarium. Those are diseases that usually the plant tag mentions with those initials that variety is resistant to. So those are really common tomato diseases. And if you want to avoid the disappointment that comes with getting verticillium wilt or fusarium wilt, which are obviously wilt type diseases that come mid or late season on tomato plants, then you choose varieties. I don't have memorized, which tomato varieties are verticillium resistant or fusarium resistant. But again, it's a time and place where you can do a little homework and choose a variety that has that has that resistance bred into it.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
welcome.
It's very interesting. Everything was very interesting.
Good. Vivian. You're muted too, Vivian. You're currently muted. There you go.
This is probably not relevant to most of the people here, but a drunk driver took out my front fence, on which there was, planted by me, something like a 30-year-old beautiful climbing rose,
Oh,
2 of them. They were completely uprooted and scattered over the lawn. There is one branch that looks as though it might be still in the ground underneath the chain link fence, which is still lying on the ground. My question is, if I try to nurse that back into some kind of life, should I cut it way down to the ground and hope that a new shoot will come up? Or what should I do? It's woody. It's about maybe an inch in diameter, or a little bit more.
mm-hmm. My advice, since I haven't seen it, of course, is to just let everything grow these first months of spring that are coming. And the reason I say that is that probably 99% of the roses that we grow are grafted. And I don't know, without you telling me or without seeing it for myself.
It's a Chicago piece.
Chicago Peace. That's a famous cultivar. So pretty much every Chicago Peace, rose individual that's out there has been grafted. And the question now that's critical is whether the piece that you have that you described to us is above the graft, which is Chicago Peace, or whether it's below the graft, which is just rootstock.
I think it's still the Chicago Peace.
Then if that's the case, then you are in luck, because you can, if you're patient enough, utilize that to enjoy, some new growth of that rose that you've been caring for all of this time. It will take time. I don't know how misshapen it is, but if you have some woody
It just
material
kind of
there,
goes up like this. It's like a slight curve, but
yeah,
it's heading up there.
yeah. So I think that again, I would probably just let it grow this year to get its legs back, and so to speak, to regain some strength. And in its second year, once you're confident that you have the scion, the part that grows above the graft, then you can cut it back to where you want it to start growing from, and hopefully it will spread out from there. It'll produce several new stems when you head it off with a heading cut next year at this time.
But
And
not
you'll
to
have
cut it
numerous.
now.
Say
Not
again.
to cut it back now.
I wouldn't. I'd let it grow this year and cut it back. If it seems to be a success, cut it back in mid-February of 2023.
Oh,
Yeah, that's my advice.
I have one last question about mulch or compost.
Sure.
Is it okay to use like the commercial grade mint, blended mint compost? I mean, does that make it unorganic if you use that kind of compost?
I thought about this question too, Jerry. Yeah, it's maybe gilding the lily. There's probably some fantastic purists out there that don't want to use an organic product like blended mint compost because the mint wasn't organically grown. So I'm not that much of a purist myself, but if I was to learn that the mint was that product is made from was very heavily sprayed with pesticides, then I would certainly mention it to people who might be more of a purist than me, or might be more sensitive or concerned about it. For example,
Okay.
if someone was growing an organic farm where they have to be certified organic, and if, again, now we have if upon if, but if I were to learn that mint was heavily sprayed with pesticides, that wouldn't be a good choice. Also, I don't usually want to speculate about something that I'm not sure about, but it seems like more than one person, a few people have told me about their concerns that Lane Forest's blended mint compost might be carrying some invasive weed seeds that haven't been killed in the composting process. So
Really?
I feel obliged to say I've used the product for clients dozens of times, and in no case did I hear that a product came from that. But it's too many times that other people who I meet for the first time tell me that they think that they have this invasive plant in their garden because of blended mint compost, that I feel obliged to mention it.
And I think that's what happened with this stuff I got from Rexius last year.
It can happen.
I don't typically buy from Rexius for all kinds of reasons, but
Yeah.
everybody had it, and pandemic and getting stuff was difficult, and
Yeah, I understand. And I was talking about getting the compost to the right temperature. When you get up to about 170 degrees Fahrenheit, it tends to kill the pathogens that might be in the compost. It tends to cook out the weed seeds, etc. But companies like Rexius and Lane Forest Products are composting on a gigantic scale. And are they able to be universally perfect? Well, it's hard to imagine that they are. They're very good at what they're doing. They're even pumping air inside the piles, because they have these gigantic piles and they need to have air in them. So they not only water them, but they have pipes running through it to aerate the piles. And they're turning them, and they're experienced, right? Beyond what we are. But are they able to get every cubic foot of that product perfectly safe and perfectly free of weed seeds? Well, even if they're able to 99.9% of the time, it still means there'll be some mishaps, right? So there you go.
What did you say the correct temperature for compost is? If you have a thermometer, I'm going to go get one.
Yeah, you can probably get something more certain than I am, but I want to say that the good stuff is really happening above 140, 150 degrees, and above 170 or 175 degrees is unnecessary. It's also really hard to get those temperatures for very long. When I got really into it in my 20s, I would pay a lot of attention to it and mix it and add water and take the temperature. And I could get the middle of the compost pile of like a 3 by 3 foot heap. I could get it to 170 degrees for a couple of days. And it would stay there for just a couple of days. And then the nitrous stuff, the nitrogen sources would sort of get cooked out of it, and it would become ashy. And I had to mix the pile or add new sources of nitrogen to regain those temperatures. But anyway, if you do it, you'll quickly become proficient at it, and learn some of the tricks of doing it. But yeah, basically above 140, above 150, you want to have that kind of temperature to cook out and mitigate weed seeds that might go into it. You also,
how often do you need to turn compost?
How often?
Yeah, I've been really bad with my compost. It takes a couple years to compost, and I often thought it just didn't get enough sun, but I think if it's the right amount of carbon, nitrogen, it wouldn't matter.
That's correct. Yeah, what you were doing, I sometimes call passive composting, and everything will rot basically, right? It'll all eventually rot. You can have a wood pile, and if you ignore it long enough, it'll decompose, but that's only getting its nitrogen to decompose from the air. You know, there's a little bit of nitrogen in our air too, right? And the rain brings it down. But yeah, you probably, to be actively composting as effectively as possible, you're probably turning it every week. Some people might, who are really into it, like when I was doing it a lot, I was even doing it a couple of times a week just to maximize everything. But your own energy and time for this activity will have something to do with dictating that schedule. I'm sure that doing it 2 times a month is much better than doing it 2 times a year.
Thank you.
Yeah, other questions? All right, well, what time have we got? We've got 3:20. So on the screen, Phyllis shared a piece of this calendar of tasks that I made, and this calendar, you'll see it really doesn't have that many things in it. I only put things in there that I thought were relevant because they're different or distinct from things that a regular gardener does anyway. So I saw no reason to sort of announce, every time you're going to mow your lawn. But I did mention, I think somewhere, oh, there it is in the spring, that when you're mowing your lawn, that you can mulch your lawn or grass recycle, which is a way of returning the lawn clippings back into the lawn. So I was talking when we spoke of composting about how rich grass clippings are in nitrogen. And most of the fertilizer or nutrients that a lawn needs is nitrogen. So letting the grass clippings, especially if they're finely chopped up, return to the lawn or just stay on the lawn is a great way of providing the lawn with a lot of the nutrients that it needs. I would footnote that in my own work, we don't do that between approximately October and the beginning of May. And why do we not? Because the crux of organic gardening, I said, is feeding the soil. But the microbial population is very much diminished during those cooler months that we have. So what is the value of organic material in the soil between October and the beginning of May? It's not valueless, but it's really different. The microbial population really doesn't start to grow fast or burgeon until you get to what I call like picnic weather or tomato growing weather, short sleeves weather. When you get to that point in May, that it feels really good to be outside without a lot of extra clothes on. That's about the same time that the soil temperature around here gets to 55 degrees, an average of 55 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. And that's when the microbial population in the soil that I said has billions of individuals in each shovelful, that's when it starts to really explode. And that's when they can really make use of the nutrients that are in the soil. So if you do some fertilizing, let's pretend that you transplant something during the month of January, and you add some alfalfa meal to the hole to give it some nutrients. You haven't wasted your time, you haven't wasted your money by doing that. It's just that the nutrients that you provided in the form of alfalfa meal, they're not really going to be consumed and digested by the microbes in the soil until you get to about May or June. And they'll continue to feed on that until you get to about October. And then that population starts to dwindle as the soil temperature drops. So there's just not a lot happening. So getting back to the grass mulching or grass recycling, I ask my crew not to do the grass mulching once we get to about October 1st, because the soil temperature drops and that stuff, it tends to just sit on the surface and not really decompose very well. It kind of gets all slimy and it just sits there, and it probably creates sort of a little bit of a thatchy material. So we'll usually bag it from October, literally bag it from about October 1 until maybe May Day. And then the clients that are amenable to it will start to mulch the clippings again. The mowers that we have an extra plug that you put into the discharge chute instead of the bag, and it pushes it allows the grass to stay in that that area where the blades are, and we have a second blade to help chop it up smaller, so there's really fine particles that are falling instead of longer bits of grass. The grass mulching doesn't work that well if you're cutting off 3 inches at a time, but if you're just cutting off a little bit, like on a weekly basis or a bi-weekly basis, then it works pretty well and doesn't leave a mess. So there you go. Other questions? All right. Well, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
That was awesome.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll send out a note with a link for how to find this on TBI's YouTube channel.
Cool.
And Bruce, once again, thank you so much.
Oh,
Appreciate your willingness to share all your knowledge with us.
enjoyed it. It was nice spending time with you. I'm going to check the chats for a moment, see if there's anything important I missed there, and then I'll take my leave. So thanks all.
I put the link to the lab in Portland that does the soil testing if anybody wants it.
That's great. Yeah, Oriana, that's actually a great find. I'm going to look up A&L Labs because of the amazing price that you mentioned. Eugene has a lab also on 5th Avenue downtown, approximately, I don't know, Lawrence or maybe a little bit west of there. And it's called Analytical Labs, I think it's called. And it's on the north side of 5th Avenue. And they charge a lot more than $18. I've only gone there a few times because there's relatively few clients that will go ahead and have a soil test. But I think it's a great idea to know what pH is and to know what nutrients might be lacking for people that want to do a comprehensive soil battery.
Yeah, it's possible that it's more if you do something bigger than what I did, but I just gave them a bag about this big, and I took from like 3 places in my food garden and sent it to them.
Yeah, that's sort of standard operating procedure for that. That's
yeah.
how you do it. Yeah. All right, take care all.
All right, thanks again.
Yeah, bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.